Hello and welcome to WashingtonTok. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea's satellite launch ended in failure due to an unreliable new engine system and fuel. The setback comes just days after South Korea successfully put satellites into orbit using only South Korean technology. Today, we look at the two Korea's space programs that show a stark contrast.
We're going to continue to work with allies and partners on holding Kim Jong-un and his regime accountable.
The United States will take all necessary measures to ensure the security of our homeland and the defense of our allies.
엔진 점화. 2류가 발사되었습니다.
독자 개발한 누리호의 3차 발사가 국민의 관심과 성원 속에 성공적으로 완료되었음을
In the studio with me, Lieutenant General Wallace Chip Gregson, President of the W.C. Gregson and Associates. Lieutenant General Gregson was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. He also served as the Commanding General of Marine Corps Forces Pacific. Also joining us, Mr. Vann Van Diepen, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. Mr. Van Diepen was the National Intelligence Officer for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
Now, Mr. Van Diepen, the possibility of failure is inherent in any satellite launch, but North Korea has successfully launched ICBMs before, which uses similar technology, and also put into orbit satellites in 2012 and 2016. Why fail this time?
We don't know for sure based on what they said and based on the items that the South Koreans recovered. It looks like the second stage failed to ignite, and it was the second stage in particular that the North Koreans seemed to be referring to when they talked about having a new engine with a new type of fuel.
Right. They did talk about the new engine and the new type of fuel. Does that lead to higher possibility of a failure?
Well, certainly something that's new has a higher risk of failure than something that's tried and true. And the first stage did work, and it now appears from the photographs that the North Koreans released yesterday that first stage is based on the Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile, and that is a system with a much better track record.
Right. So it was Hwasong-15 is something with a good track record, but why fail this time?
Again, I mean, you know, it's a probabilities game in the first instance, and really only the North Koreans can answer that question based on whatever telemetry data they may have been able to collect. Now, because the South Koreans have recovered some components, you know, they might be able to reach some conclusions after analysis as well. But really, at this point, from the outside, you can't tell for sure.
Mr. Van Diepen, North Korea says it will investigate serious defects and conduct a second launch as soon as possible. South Korea's National Intelligence Service expects it to be a few weeks' time. Normally, how long does it take before a stable relaunch?
In a sort of normal space launch country, it would probably take a matter of months for a very careful diagnosis to be made and then any changes to be made in order to fix whatever went wrong. But North Korea doesn't have normal space launch vehicle testing practices, and there's a very large political component in their decision-making related to test activities. So it's really going to be up to the North Koreans, and my guess is up to Kim himself as to when the next test is going to be.
General Gregson, how does North Korea's military satellite reconnaissance satellites add to North Korea's military capabilities?
Well, one satellite is only the beginning, and one satellite won't give you much. We also have to assume that North Korea's got an effective intelligence network operating in South Korea, so It won't be necessarily producing unique data for the North Koreans, but it'll put a satellite, and even better, a satellite network, a number of satellites to maintain consistent coverage will give you a difference in timeliness. It's instantaneous rather than whatever time it takes to get other reports to North Korea about what's happening in South Korea or Japan or the United States.
One satellite wouldn't make a big difference. How many would make a difference?
10 would be good.
Mr. Van Diepen, if North Korea puts satellites into sun-synchronous orbit, that satellite only returns to the Korean Peninsula just a couple times a day for a few minutes. In order to watch the Korean Peninsula 24/7, how many satellites need to be put into orbit?
Well, first, I think 24/7 isn't really the way to think about it, because these satellites probably rely on visible light cameras. It's only going to be in the daytime that there's a possibility of getting useful imagery of South Korea. But I think, people have talked about sort of 3 to 5 satellites as being at least a good start. And certainly the more satellites you have, the better off you are. But there are also going to be questions of what their capability is to bring that data down to the ground, what's their capability to analyze that data, to disseminate the results to the people who need to get it. It's not just the satellites that you need as part of a reconnaissance system.
General Gregson, in April 2012, North Korea, when they launched the satellite, they invited foreign journalists, and a VOA reporter was also there, and he caught a North Korean delegate saying that we cannot rule out the possibility that space technology could be used militarily if we are forced to. North Korea contends that they are doing peaceful space developments, but isn't this comment showing North Korea's true colors?
If developing a technology to launch a satellite also indicates development of technology that can deliver a warhead, the rocket systems and everything serve both needs. It just depends on the product you put on the top. For North Korea to say that they're doing all this for self-defense or for awareness is laughable.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Van Diepen, North Korea said the new satellite would be tracking and monitoring U.S. military actions. Some say North Korea has low-resolution capabilities of about 1 meter per pixel. Do you agree? And is there any military use if they have such resolution?
Well, of course, we don't know what sort of resolution they might have in whatever satellite that they tried to orbit, but it's probably not very good. But even with that quality of imagery, you can get what's called indications and warning intelligence. If there is a military buildup in the south for some reason, this would allow the North Koreans to detect that. They might not be able to get sort of precise, what they call science and technology, S&T data on, what's the size of that tank, what kind of gun does it have, that sort of thing. But it's still incredibly useful to be able to get a general sense of what's going on militarily in the other country.
General Gregson, this time the debris fell off on the West Sea, but there is a possibility that next time it could fall on a populated city in South Korea or Japan, in which case, how can military respond to such accidents?
Well, I think that the Korean KAMD defense network would be able to respond to threats of debris, but when you blow something up in the atmosphere, when you blow something up in space that descends into the atmosphere, a lot of it's going to get through. I don't see that that's totally avoidable. Plus, if South Korea is in the position of having to fire missiles to defend themselves, there's probably bigger targets to shoot at than the debris that's coming down. I don't think there's any way we can guarantee the population that various pieces of North Korean weapons that were destroyed would not land in South Korea.
But I think we also shouldn't overstate the possibility that that could happen to a populated area. It's very clear from the closure areas that they announced that the North Koreans went out of their way to try to avoid overflying neighboring countries. And the accident we saw showed that that stage landed well far away from even the coast of South Korea, much less a populated area. So I don't think we should spend too much time focusing on this, possibility of debris falling on populated areas.
General Gregson, how will North Korea's satellite launch impact the security of the U.S., South Korea, and Japan? And how should the defense posture change?
We've been seeking for a long time to establish a trilateral defense network. I'm hopeful that in view of President Yoon's recent activities and his meetings with Prime Minister Kishida, that we're drawing close to where we can share data, where we can share early warning, and very much increase our ability to defend South Korea by integrating the U.S. and the Japanese networks.
So will North Korea's satellite launch push the three countries to the direction where they integrate their missile defense system?
It remains to be seen if it will effectively push us closer to integration, but it certainly should.
Now, Mr. Van Diepen, North Korea's nuclear and missile developments is quickly advancing. Is the satellite development also at fast pace? And some people question the effectiveness of the sanctions regime, but did the sanctions somehow work to slow down North Korea's satellite development?
Well, I mean, they've been talking about doing satellites for a long time. They've only now had their first launch, which was a failure. So I'm not sure you're in a position to say whether that program is moving quickly or slowly. And of course, we don't know how good that satellite is. In all likelihood, not just the sanctions, but the system of export controls that's been in place for decades, interdiction measures like the Proliferation Security Initiative, the whole complex of things that are done in non-proliferation have almost certainly had an impact in slowing not only the satellite part of the program, but the rocket part of the program, making it take longer, making it cost more, making it being less effective and less reliable than it would have been if those controls were not in place.
North Korea put into orbit satellites in 2012 and 2016. It is the first time in 7 years that North Korea launched another satellite. Do you think North Korea imported the entire satellite program from another country like Russia?
The entire program, I think that's highly unlikely. Satellite technology has been around long enough. And if you look, countries around the globe develop their own satellites. They usually pay other countries to launch them, but they often develop the satellites themselves. And so, quite a bit of that could have been done by the North Koreans themselves, although probably based on education and know-how that they received from other countries, probably China and Russia, as well as equipment and components that they probably received through their clandestine procurement network.
General Gregson, what concerns you the most when you look at North Korea's satellite and missile programs?
What concerns me the most is their ability to reach out at distance and strike wherever they wish.
Right.
There could be a strong coercive factor here where they can intimidate other countries, and there's also the threat of North Korea lashing out, and it's something we need to be prepared for. This brings me back to your other question about a cooperative network between the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the United States. We need to have the strong surveillance that we can create through that network so that we know exactly what they're doing. And if North Korea does launch something that is not following one of the prescribed test patterns or or one of the ways they've tested missiles before, that we have the capability to destroy that missile before it hits somebody.
General Gregson, the U.S. is clear that North Korea's satellite launch is unacceptable, but is there a practical means to punish North Korea, especially when China and Russia are wielding veto powers at the UN Security Council? Should Chinese facilitators be sanctioned?
Certainly, if we discover somebody facilitating North Korea's clandestine arms procurement practice and their clandestine arms sales practice and their clandestine trading in nuclear technology and materials, but getting effective sanctions to change North Korean behavior has proven to be very hard. Sanctions are capable of being evaded. North Korea shares a border with Russia and China. North Korea's got a worldwide criminal network that supports their efforts in defense and in money making. So declaring sanctions in a way, makes us feel better. And on the American side, we're always fond of putting descriptions on sanctions that they'll be the strongest ever, and then either through difficulties in detecting evasion of sanctions, violation of sanctions, or other means, we lose interest in it, and the sanctions prove to be not nearly as effective as we thought they were.
Should the United States target Chinese or Russian entities that help North Korea?
I would hope we are.
China is increasingly being assertive to the neighboring countries in the region. How does that help with North Korea's agenda?
China very much favors the continued existence of North Korea in its current form because there's such a drain on resources from South Korea, the United States, and other countries.
Now, South Korea, meanwhile, successfully launched its homegrown space rocket, Nuri. Mr. Van Diepen, President Yoon Suk-yeol says South Korea is now Space Group of 7. How much a space powerhouse is South Korea?
Well, it's basically the 10th country that's been able to orbit its own satellite using its own space launch vehicles.
This time they launched commercial satellites, but how does it also help with the military ability?
Well, first of all, it's helping to prove out the booster so that same rocket could launch either civil satellites or military satellites. And South Korea has indicated that they are in the process of developing military reconnaissance satellites. And I'm sure that there are aspects of the technology of the satellite itself that would also help them with the military reconnaissance satellite.
General Gregson, North Korea argues countries are applying double standards when it comes to its own weapons development. How come South Korea can launch satellites and not get condemned by international community, whereas North Korea is banned from doing such?
Well, first, the Korean War is not settled. It's in armistice because North Korea refuses to sign a peace treaty. Number two, Korea is an ally of the United States, so we're going to support South Korea in what they're doing there. South Korea did not do something like threaten to turn Seoul into a sea of fire, as the North Koreans have. North Korea also, interestingly enough, threatened to turn former Defense Secretary Bill Perry's home into a sea of fire. And I wanted to ask whether it was his home in California or his original home in Butler, Pennsylvania, to see what kind of range we're talking about here. South Korea didn't do something like sink the Cheonan. South Korea didn't do something like murder 2 of our soldiers in the joint security area. So no, North Korea should continue to be banned from using weapons.
Mr. Van Diepen, how would you answer North Korea's complaints about double standards?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's a complaint. It's an excuse. They understand quite well that they're under UN Security Council prohibitions from engaging in launches using ballistic missile technology. Now, they flout those restrictions, but they understand that they're there. And they also know why those restrictions were put in place, because of North Korea's nuclear activities and its violation and then leaving of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And South Korea did none of those things. It does not have nuclear weapons. It is a member in good standing of the NPT. It is not the subject of a UN Security Council prohibition. So it's an entirely apples and oranges situation.
And also North Korea threatens to strike South Korea.
Sure, they threaten a lot of people all the time, but I'm not sure that, strictly speaking, that's the reason why the international community condemns their missile activities. But yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to recommend North Korea as a responsible missile-holding state.
And they've struck South Korea in the past. They attacked the Blue House. They shelled Pyongyang-do, I believe. Yongbyon-do. They sank the Cheonan and various smaller attacks on South Korea. So North Korea's got no room to talk about just peaceful defensive measures.
And again, this is, the standard, whether it's double or not, is based on North Korea's own behavior. They're the ones who deliberately engaged in all these different activities, including the nuclear activities that got them subject to the UN Security Council sanctions in the first place.
Mr. Van Diepen, as China's military threat grows, does South Korea's space capabilities also contribute in responding to China's threat? And how important is South Korea's space program to the United States?
I mean, on the China question, I mean, first and foremost, that's sort of up to the South Koreans to answer. It's their space program, and they'll decide what it contributes to and what it doesn't contribute to. Space cooperation has always been a very important part of U.S.-South Korea cooperation. South Korea has a lot to offer technologically, it's also, frankly, a potential good place for U.S. companies to do business in that kind of cooperation. So there are, a lot of good reasons for that kind of cooperation to go on.
General Gregson, when VOA asked President Yoon Suk-yeol about OPCON transfer shortly after he was elected, he said, first, we need to secure a reasonable level of intelligence capabilities for conducting surveillance and reconnaissance operations that will allow conducting a joint wartime operation. Did South Korea's successful satellite launch fast forward the timing for OPCON transfer?
It may very well. The Combined Forces Command is a unique structure. There's never been anything like it. There's not likely to be anything like it again. The existence of U.S. and Korean personnel together in the same command, the ability to integrate Korean and American forces and the rest of the UN contributing forces in the event of a conflict is thoroughly unique, as is the continuous readiness posture of the fight tonight posture, which is very demanding, but it works very well. I'm not as current as I used to be on all the inner workings and hidden mechanisms within the OPCON transfer, but we did it before in '92 or '93 when we transferred OPCON in Defense Condition 5 and Defense Condition 4. When I was still Assistant Secretary, there was a list of things that U.S. and Korea had agreed upon that needed to be done before we formally declared operational control transferred. Where we stand on that in these days, I don't know, but certainly the successful South Korean launch should certainly contribute to that.
But we should keep in mind that this was not the launch of a military reconnaissance satellite. So there's still not such a satellite up. And as we discussed before, you need more than one satellite. You need to have the appropriate facilities to handle that data, process it, analyze it, disseminate that data to the field, do that in conjunction with the U.S. as part of a joint command. So, this launch in and of itself may be sort of a milestone down the road, but it doesn't necessarily change an awful lot.
General Gregson, what task is left for South Korea before the OPCON transfer happens? We talked about communications.
The U.S. established and maintains a really exquisite data network, one of a kind as far as I know across the world between two allies. The agreement used to be that South Korea needed to raise their capability to manage such a network before we transferred OPCON.
Mr. Van Diepen, South Korea largely relies on U.S. signals intelligence and U.S. military satellites. If South Korea advances its own satellite program, does that mean U.S. will have less influence over South Korea, or would that be a win-win situation for both?
I think it's more likely a win-win situation. Anyone in the intelligence business is always going to want more intelligence from more sources. So I don't see this as a situation of one taking the place of the other.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Van Diepen, General Gregson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.